My name is Oshagan. I'm a photographer. I come from a long line of artists in my family, actually. Writers mostly, from my grandfather, who was also a survivor of the Armenian genocide. He was also gathered up with the rest of the intellectuals, but he was able to escape. My father was also a poet in his own time. He had a very, very confrontational approach to literature. He wanted to break all taboos that were in Armenian literature at the time. He had studied in France, and he brought a lot of the Western elements into Armenian literature, knowing sort of the structure. And so his whole idea was to sort of break up, create a new literature. For instance, he was the first poet to bring street language, like slang, into poetry, which was absolutely unheard of before he did it in the 60s. And it created a huge uproar. People walked out on his lectures because he said things that were not popular. So I come from that kind of background, which is, it's kind of a double-edged sword, actually. You get this kind of momentum given to you that comes from a legacy, but also it's very important to be able to, as an artist, get out from under the shadow that your ancestors cast on you. And for a long time, I wanted to become a writer. And then one day, I don't know why, I was dealing with community issues and the disrupted community thing. And so I wanted writing photos with my writing to go hand in hand together. And I couldn't find anybody to take really good pictures, the kind of pictures that I wanted, right? Disruptive or something different, you know? So I said, hey, I have to do it myself. Writing is a solitary, still sort of endeavor, right? You sit with yourself, with your table, with your computer, whatever, and for hours you're just sitting. And photography is just the opposite. The photography is constant movement, constant motion. Anyway, the photography that I do, documentary photography, you're constantly moving, meeting and working, and it's constant active sort of thing. So I think I connected to that significantly. Where do you start? You start in your backyard, right? LA and Armenian community, LA, both of them together, where I was living at the time and working and doing whatever. And so that's what it was. I started just photographing the community. And you start with events, and then you get deeper and deeper into families and things. I photographed, for instance, my wife's family for a long, long time, and they became a large part of that project. It's called really Traces of Identity, and that's really sort of the connectivity between a lot of my work, which is an attempt to find this identity that you see in different places. This identity that is at its core is a disrupted community. So what does that identity look like, right? The work is partially about what the community looks like, but it's really about what it means to be in that state. So it's all about how I photographed and what I saw personally in those spaces. People really inspire me, right? I sometimes go out and take pictures of landscapes, and I'm not moved by that for whatever reason. I'm not moved by that. I'm moved by people, by seeing people, by talking to people, by being in that space where people live. Wherever their lives are, I like to be in that space and try to capture some reflection of that space in my work. I come from what I call a disrupted community. To me, it kind of crystallized itself in a very specific way in 1995 when I went downtown to see an event that the community was held. And they had brought 80 survivors. It was the 80th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And they had brought 80 survivors to the space to get on stage. And so I watched them, and they were very elderly, really elderly. They walked slowly, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them barely knew where they were. And I mean, you look at this 80 people, and you saw, next step for them is they're going to pass away. The one step is in the grave for them, And I was completely overcome by this feeling that I have to take their photos, and I have to take it now. And so I had to basically teach myself how to do portrait photography. Borrowed a camera and borrowed some lighting, and then fortunately, right when I was starting, I met Levon Parian, who's actually a portrait and commercial photographer. He brought in a lot of what he knew, and I brought in a lot of what I knew, and we started working together on this project. Well, the black backdrop signifies the genocide, right? It signifies the catastrophe in which they came out of, right? They were in that space. So what we wanted to do is replace the current day context in which we saw them with a black background. So wipes out the present. And then what we typically do, we put their stories with their photos. That recontextualizes their image with the story of back then. And so brings in the past through the words of them telling their story of what happened to them 100 years ago. Both my mother and my father fled from different places. My mother was actually born in Iraq. They fled to Beirut, and they met there. And so I was born in Beirut, lived in Beirut for 10 years, and then we fled the Civil War in 1975 and came to the United States. My father had 6 passports in his life. So there's a continual disruption in my own family of place and community and family. But also that parallels the continual disruption of the Armenian nation. I look for that disruption, and to find it, I go to the source, which is my community, the people that I've grown up with and I live with. What does it mean to be in this kind of disruptive, diasporic sort of existence? So my father had gone back and forth to Karabakh. In the mid-90s, he had taught at the university there, Stepanakert, and he had created a lot of ties with the community there. And then I was just getting into photography. I had just started with my community project. And then my father and I went together in '99, and we spent like 3 weeks together there, and he wrote and I photographed. He finished what he wanted to write for our book, but he had heart issues, and he had heart surgery, and he didn't make it out of heart surgery. So he passed away in 2000, like a year after we went. But he had written what he had written for our book. And so I had a big decision to make there. Do I publish the book as it is with my photographs, and I had gone only twice? Or do I photograph some more? I decided to photograph some more because my father's writing was it wasn't very time specific, and he didn't write time specific. It isn't that he wrote about this thing and it inspired me to go photograph that thing, or it's not directly related that way. I would read it and then my imagination would get sparked. The way I work is not very predictable, let's say. It's not, I'm gonna go do this, I'm gonna take pictures like this, I'm gonna go here, take these pictures. It's much more, there's a random walk in it, in that I decided, all right, I'm gonna photograph in this region. And I encounter whatever I encounter, and I interact with whatever I interact with. And then through that process of being in that space and being in people's lives, make pictures that are reflective of the meaning of their lives, not just what they look like, but what the meaning is. That's why, for instance, I like to work in black and white, because black and white is much more about form than emotion. Shapes and forms and angles and things, really, I connect with those things. Form was very, very important for my grandfather and for my father. So that kind of thing came to me, and it is, to me, it's very important. The way you speak in that language is very, very important. So you have to create your own language within that language. And that's what I've tried to do. That's what I've tried to come up with, my own way of seeing and photographing, which challenges the sort of the standard way that people photograph. Well, yeah, in many ways, it is all about identity, right? Through the arc of my work, starting with genocide survivors, that goes back to 1915, 20s, to Karabakh, and then, of course, the Los Angeles community here. So there's this arc of work, and now it's also Beirut that fills in one of the gaps. So this becomes like 4 different major projects that explore this kind of arc of identity, yes, Armenian identity, but also identity in general, right? It could be Armenian, it could be Latino, it could be black. Being Armenian, in a sense, becomes secondary to the more important idea of what it is that happens over 3 generations when you have this traumatic, disruptive event and things are constantly getting disrupted. What does that look like? How is that interconnected? How is that passed through the generations? It just happens, for whatever reason, I'm Armenian, and so I look at it from that context. I look at it from that platform, but it's not specific in that sense.